There was a night years ago when I should not have made it home. The rain had turned the highway into black glass. My headlights reached only a few yards ahead, catching silver sheets of water before they vanished beneath the car. I was driving too fast, though I had nowhere important to be. That was the kind of man I was then, always rushing, always trying to outrun a silence I refused to understand. A truck crossed into my lane. I remember the horn first, low, violent, then the white glare filling the windshield. I turned the wheel without thinking. The car spun, struck the barrier, and stopped facing the wrong direction. For several seconds, there was no sound except rain tapping the roof and my own breath coming apart inside my chest. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange peace. It did not belong there. Not in the smell of burned rubber, not in the shattered glass beside me, not with death still passing in the opposite lane. Yet something seemed to settle over me, as though an unseen hand had reached into the wreckage and said, "Not yet." I did not tell anyone that part. People would have called it shock. Perhaps it was. I have no proof that anything beyond instinct saved me that night. But even then, before I believed in signs, it did not feel random. Have you ever survived something and later wondered why you were allowed to continue? Maybe you understand the guilt hidden inside survival. The quiet suspicion that being spared creates a debt you do not yet know how to repay. I went home before dawn. The electricity was out and the apartment was cold. I stood in the bathroom with a candle burning beside the sink. My face appeared and disappeared in the trembling light. Older than I remembered, emptier than I wanted to admit. I looked successful from the outside. The tailored suits, the growing company, the invitations, handshakes, rooms where people listened when I spoke. But in that mirror, none of it could answer the simplest question. Why was I still here? Something inside me whispered, "Pay attention." I ignored it. For years, I called that night luck. I buried it beneath meetings, achievements, women I could not love properly, and promises I made only because I feared being alone. I became skilled at building a life that required no stillness, but life kept circling me back. A missed flight that later crashed through a storm severe enough to injure passengers. A doctor's appointment I nearly canceled that revealed a problem early. A message from an old friend arriving on the exact night I had decided I no longer wanted to keep fighting. Appointments disguised as accidents. At first, I resisted the pattern. A man who believes he controls his own destiny does not like being reminded how little control he has. Then, somewhere between one closed door and another, I stopped calling it coincidence. I began to wonder whether I was being redirected, not punished. Perhaps every delay was moving me away from the wrong life. Perhaps every heartbreak was pulling me back before I lost to a place, a place it could not survive. Perhaps loneliness was not such evidence that I had been forgotten. Perhaps I was being kept for someone, for you. I know how that sounds. We may not have met when these things happened. I may not have known your name, your voice, or the private griefs you carried through your own nights. Still, when I look back now, I feel as though time was shaping us separately, teaching us the same language through different wounds. You and I were written into the same script long before we met. And that night on the highway, when death came close enough for me to see its face, perhaps I was not merely spared. Perhaps I was being sent forward, toward the woman listening now. After the highway, the signs did not become louder. They became more patient. That may be what frightens me most when I look back. Life did not chased me down with thunder or visions. It placed small things in my path and waited to see whether I would notice. A clock stopping at the same hour 3 nights in a row. A song I had not heard in 20 years playing in 3 different places within 1 week. The same sentence spoken by strangers who had never met each other. Maybe you are not late. Maybe you are being delayed. The first time, it came from a taxi driver in Chicago. Snow was gathering at the edges of the street, turning the city quiet beneath the traffic. I had missed a meeting that could have changed the direction of my business. I was furious, checking my phone, calculating what the delay would cost me. The driver looked at me through the mirror. "Sometimes," he said, "the wrong time saves you from the wrong room." I barely answered. 2 days later, the man I was supposed to meet was arrested for fraud. I stood by the window of my hotel room, watching snow collect on the buildings below. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt watched. Not watched in the way fear watches us. Held, as though something had moved me 1 step to the side while danger passed through the place where I had intended to stand. I told myself it was coincidence. That word became a shelter for me. It protected me from the possibility that my life had meaning beyond what I could measure. Because if something was guiding me, then I had to admit I was not the author of every chapter. I had to admit there might be a hand greater than mine turning pages I had not yet read. Perhaps you have done that too. Perhaps you have called something random because the alternative felt too intimate, too unsettling, too hopeful. There was another moment, years later, in an airport in Madrid. My flight was canceled after we had already boarded. People were angry. The cabin was hot, filled with stale air and the sound of luggage compartments opening. I remember looking through the window at the runway lights, glowing red through the fog. I had been traveling to see a woman I thought I loved. By morning, I discovered she had been living another life beside mine. At first, the cancellation felt cruel. Later, I understood that it had given the truth time to reach me before I crossed an ocean to protect a lie. That was when I stopped calling every closed door rejection. Some doors were mercy, some delays were rescue, and some endings were life pulling me back from places where I would have disappeared inside someone else's dishonesty. Still, knowing that did not make me less lonely. That was the ache of it. I could sense I was being guided, but I could not see where. I was being spared, redirected, interrupted, and yet every night ended with the same empty room. Sometimes I would wake before dawn with the feeling that I had been speaking to someone in a dream. I could never remember her face, only the warmth of the conversation, the strange familiarity, the feeling that she understood the parts of me I had never managed to explain. Those dreams felt less like imagination and more like memory arriving early. I do not know whether you have ever dreamed of a place before visiting it or felt grief for someone you had not yet lost. But I began to wonder whether the soul recognizes appointments before the mind does, and slowly, almost unwillingly, another thought entered me.
What if the signs were not only protecting me from the wrong life? What if they were preparing me for the right person?
What if somewhere beyond my knowledge a woman was also being delayed, corrected, and gently turned away from roads that could not lead to me? I did not know it was you, not yet. But for the first time, I stopped feeling that I was wandering alone. I began to feel that someone was wandering toward me. For a long time, I believed the signs were meant to help me keep the life I had built. I did not understand that sometimes guidance does not preserve the structure. Sometimes it brings the whole thing down. The collapse began quietly. A missed call from my doctor. A number on a financial report that did not make sense. A silence from someone I trusted. Nothing dramatic at first, just small fractures running beneath the surface, invisible unless the light struck them at the right angle. Then, within 6 months, everything I had used to define myself began to disappear. A business partnership ended in betrayal. The woman beside me left without a final conversation. My body, which I had treated like a machine with no right to fail, finally refused to cooperate. I remembered the hospital room more clearly than I remember some entire years of my life. The walls were pale green. Rain traced thin lines down the window. A machine beside the bed marked time with a soft electronic pulse, each sound reminding me that my heart was still working without my permission. There was a plastic bracelet around my wrist. My name looked strange, printed there. So did the word patient. I had spent my life being the one people called when something went wrong. I knew how to negotiate, repair, command, and reassure. But lying beneath that cold hospital light, I could not bargain with my own mortality. For the first time, there was nowhere to perform. No suit, no title, no audience. Only a frightened man beneath a thin blanket, wondering whether success had been another way of hiding. That night, the corridor outside my room became silent. Even the nurse's footsteps seemed to fade. I closed my eyes and something in me finally broke open. I did not pray. Beautifully, I said, "I don't know what you want from me." That was all. The answer did not arrive as a voice. There was only a strange warmth in my chest, followed by a thought that felt too calm to belong to my fear. Stop becoming someone you were never meant to be. I opened my eyes. The room had not changed. Rain still touched the glass. The machine still counted the seconds. But I felt held in the middle of my ruin. I have no proof that God spoke to me that night. Still, did not feel random. Perhaps you know that kind of moment, the one where nothing outside improves, yet something inside becomes still enough to hear. When I left the hospital, the world looked painfully ordinary. Cars moved through intersections. People carried coffee. A child laughed outside a pharmacy. Life had continued without asking whether I was ready to rejoin it. But I was no longer the same man. I began canceling meetings that required me to betray myself. I ended friendships built only on convenience. I sat alone without turning on the television, and in that silence, I met the parts of myself I had abandoned. The proud part, the ashamed part, the boy who learned early that love could leave without warning. That was when I realized I had not merely been unlucky in love. I had been choosing people who could confirm my deepest fear. I chose distance because it felt familiar. I chose unavailable hearts because they could never truly see me. Then, when they left, I called it fate. It was not fate, it was sabotage. That truth hurt more than betrayal because it left me with no villain to blame. Yet even there, in the shame of recognizing my own pattern, I felt something gentle beneath the pain. I was being shown the wound because I was finally strong enough to stop worshiping it. I stopped calling the collapse punishment. It was an intervention. The life I had built could not carry me where I was meant to go, so it had to fall before I would release it. And somewhere in those months of recovery, I began thinking again about the woman from my dreams. Not her face, her presence, the peace surrounding her. I wondered whether I was being emptied because real love would need room to enter. Maybe you have watched your own life fall apart and feared you had missed your chance. Maybe you are still standing among pieces no one else can see.
Listen to me softly now.
Some ruins are not graves. Some are foundations being cleared. I know, because the man who entered that hospital would never have known how to love you. The man who walked out had finally begun to learn. Healing did not make the loneliness disappear. In some ways, it made it sharper. before I could hide inside noise. I had work, travel, crowded tables, and people who knew the successful version of me well enough to applaud him. Once I began removing what was false, the rooms became quieter. Honest emptiness is colder than distraction. There was one winter evening when I returned from a dinner held in my honor. My name had been engraved on a glass award. People had stood when I entered. Cameras flashed. Hands reached for mine. But when I opened the door to my house, darkness received me. The air smelled faintly of wood and dust. I set the award on the kitchen counter, and the sound of glass touching stone echoed through the room. For a long time, I stood there without taking off my coat. I had achieved something I once believed would make me feel complete. Instead, I wanted someone to ask whether I was tired. Not impressed. Not proud. Just near enough to notice. That night, I sat on the floor beside the window. Snow moved beneath the streetlight in slow, weightless circles. The silence felt almost alive. Beneath the ache, I sensed that same strange peace I had felt beside the highway and inside the hospital. Something in me whispered, "Do not fill this space carelessly." I understood the warning. Loneliness had always made me impatient. It had sent me back toward familiar people, unfinished stories, and doors that had already closed for good reasons. I mistook recognition for belonging. I confused being wanted with being known. Perhaps you have done that too. Perhaps there was a night when you almost returned to someone, not because they had changed, but because it had become unbearable. But I picked up my phone and stared at a name from my past. Before I could call, a message arrived from an old mentor I had not spoken to in months. Do not trade your future for relief from one lonely night. I read it again, then again. He later told me he did not know why he had sent it. He had been reading before bed when my face came suddenly into his mind. I put the phone down. I do not have proof that his message was anything more than timing. But it did not feel random. That was the night I stopped believing every empty space needed to be filled. Some spaces I realized were being protected. I was not being denied love. I was being prevented from settling for its imitation. Still, patience has a cost. There were mornings when I wondered whether all this talk of timing was merely a beautiful way to explain abandonment. I watched friends grow old beside people who knew their habits, their histories, the exact way they took their coffee. And I remained alone, guided perhaps, but alone. That became the hardest question of my faith. Why would life teach me how to love and give me no one to love? Then the dreams returned. In one, I was walking through a house I had never seen. Morning light crossed a wooden floor. Somewhere beyond the doorway, a woman was humming. I could not see her face, but I knew I had come home. When I woke, my pillow was wet. I carried that feeling for days, not desire, recognition, as though my soul had visited a future my life had not yet reached. If you have ever missed something you have never had, maybe you understand. That was when I began to suspect the loneliness itself was part of the path. It was teaching me not only to wait for you, but to become capable of recognizing you, because the old version of me would have loved your beauty and overlooked your wounds. He would have offered protection, but withheld truth. He would have asked you to trust him while remaining hidden. The quiet years changed that. They taught me to stay in the room when feelings became difficult. They taught me that love is not the rescue of one broken person by another. It is two people refusing to abandon themselves. or each other. And slowly, your unseen presence became less like a dream. It became a direction. I still did not know your name, but I began leaving space for you. There came a time when your presence began to feel less like imagination and more like distance, not absence. Distance. As though someone was standing on the other side of a closed door, close enough for me to sense the warmth beneath it, but not yet meant to enter. It happened first on a quiet Sunday morning. The city was almost empty. Rain had stopped before dawn, leaving the sidewalks dark and shining. I walked to a small cafe near the river, one I had passed many times but never entered. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, wet wool, and bread warming behind the counter. An old song was playing. It was the same song from my dream, the one the unseen woman had been humming in the house filled with morning light. I froze near the doorway. The melody was soft, nearly lost beneath the sound of cups and low conversation. Still, my body recognized it before my mind did. A strange warmth moved through me, followed by grief, so sudden I had to sit down. I looked toward the empty chair across from me. For one impossible second, I felt that I was waiting for someone who had already been there. I know how fragile that sounds. A song is only a song. An empty chair is only an empty chair. But something beneath the ordinary details seemed to say, she exists. Not as an idea, not as a reward for suffering, as a real woman somewhere in the same world, waking beneath another sky, carrying a life that had also asked too much of her. Perhaps you have felt that too. The sense that someone unknown was already connected to your loneliness. Maybe in your hardest moments, you spoke inwardly to a person you had not met. Maybe you whispered, "Wherever you are, please do not give up yet." I began doing that. Late at night, when the house was still, I would stand near the window and imagine my words traveling beyond the buildings, beyond the darkness, finding you wherever life had placed you. I did not ask you to hurry. I asked you to stay alive inside, to keep one small room in your heart from being occupied by bitterness, because I was trying to do the same. Then, one evening, I received a letter with no return address. It had been sent to my office by a woman who had heard me speak months earlier. She wrote only a page, thanking me for something I had said about beginning again after failure. At the bottom, she added, "Sometimes the person you are becoming is already answering a prayer you have never heard." I read that sentence under the yellow light of my desk lamp while rain touched the windows. Something in me went still. I stopped calling the feeling foolish. I stopped treating hope like a weakness that needed to be corrected. I realized that perhaps I was not being prepared for an abstract future. Perhaps my choices were already reaching into your life without either of us knowing it. Every time I refused to return to what had wounded me, I was choosing you. Every time I told the truth instead of performing strength, I was moving closer to you. Every time I learned patience, forgiveness, or the courage to remain open, I was answering a future moment in which you might need those things from me. And maybe you were doing the same. Maybe the nights that taught you boundaries were protecting what we would one day build. Maybe the love that failed you was showing you what love must never become again. Maybe every door that closed behind you was keeping you from arriving at me too early, while I was still a man who might have mistaken your tenderness for permission to remain unhealed. That thought humbled me. For years, I had asked why love had not come. I had never considered that love might have been waiting for me to become safe enough to receive it. So I began speaking to you in my prayers, though I did not know your name. I asked that you be protected from people who admired your light, but resented its source. I asked that you not confuse delay with abandonment. I asked that when the time came, something in both of us would recognize the appointment, not the perfection, the recognition. Because by then, I no longer believed we would meet by accident. I believed life was quietly teaching us how to arrive. Once I began believing someone was on the other side of all this, I expected myself to become wiser. I did not. Hope did not erase my patterns, it exposed them. There was a woman I met during that season who was kind and intelligent and patient with me. On paper, she was everything a lonely man should have wanted. But whenever she moved closer, something in me withdrew. I became busy, careful, difficult to reach. I told myself I was protecting my peace. In truth, I was protecting the wound that had taught me closeness was dangerous. One evening, we sat in a restaurant near the harbor. Candles moved inside small glass holders, and beyond the window, the water was almost black. She looked at me for a long time before asking, "Why do you become distant whenever someone tries to love you?" The room seemed to disappear around us. I heard plates touching tables, rain beginning against the glass, a boat horn somewhere in the dark. Beneath all of it, something inside me whispered, "Do not defend yourself." Listen. But I did defend myself. I spoke about work, timing, pressure. I used polished words to hide an unpolished fear. She left gently a few weeks later. There was no betrayal, no villain. Only a good person refusing to remain outside a door I would not open. For months, I told myself she had not been the one. That may have been true. But the deeper truth was that I had not yet been myself. Perhaps you understand this kind of regret, not the regret of losing the wrong person, but of seeing clearly how your own fear entered the room before love had a chance. I had spent years asking destiny to bring me someone honest while perfecting the art of concealment. That realization followed me everywhere. It found me in elevators, in empty hotel rooms, in the silence after phone calls. It stood beside me each morning while I shaved, asking whether I would recognize love if I kept expecting it to leave. Then came another narrow escape, though not the kind involving metal or blood. I nearly returned to a relationship that had once reduced me to someone I did not respect. A message arrived after midnight. Only 4 words. "I still think of you." The screen glowed in the dark bedroom. My heart responded before my wisdom did. Old memories rose with their familiar warmth, editing out every night I had felt invisible. I typed a reply. Before sending it, I caught my reflection in the window. My face hovered over the darkness outside, pale and uncertain. For a moment, I saw the man I had been, the one who confused longing with instruction. Then the power went out. The room became completely black. I laughed, though there was nothing funny about it. When the lights returned, the message I had written was gone. I do not have proof that the darkness meant anything, but it did not feel random. I placed the phone face down. That night, I stopped calling my patterns fate. Destiny may guide us, but it does not excuse our sabotage. Sometimes the door closes because we are protected. Sometimes we are the ones who must stop reaching for the handle. That distinction changed me. I began asking harder questions. Was I lonely? Or was I addicted to being pursued by people incapable of staying? Was I waiting for love? Or hiding behind the idea of perfect timing so I would never have to risk rejection again? The answers humbled me. And then, somehow, they gave me hope. Because if I had helped create my loneliness, then I was not powerless inside it. I could choose differently. I could become honest before I felt safe. I could remain present when fear told me to disappear. I could stop punishing new love for old crimes. Maybe you have patterns you are ashamed to admit. Maybe you have pushed away what you prayed for because receiving it required a version of you that had not yet learned to stay. I am not asking you to condemn yourself. I am telling you what I had to learn. Awareness is not a sentence. It is a doorway. And every time I stepped through it, I felt closer to you. Not because I had become perfect, because I had finally stopped pretending I was not afraid. There was a season when I became angry at time itself. Not at God, not at the people who had left, at time. It seemed to move too quickly through everything except the one thing I wanted most. Years passed, my hair silvered at the temples. Friends celebrated anniversaries while I learned to eat alone without making the silence feel like punishment. I told myself I had become patient, but patience spoken proudly is often only disappointment wearing better clothes. One evening, I found an old watch in the bottom drawer of my desk. It had belonged to my father. The leather strap was cracked, and the hands had stopped at 2:17. I remembered him wearing it when I was a boy, tapping the glass whenever I made us late. He had spent his life measuring minutes, as though enough discipline could protect him from losing them. He died younger than either of us expected. I sat there beneath the green light of the desk lamp, holding that stopped watch in my palm. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Sirens in the distance, tires whispering over wet streets, windows going dark one by one. For the first time, I understood that my fear of being late was really fear of being denied. I thought love had a deadline. I believed there was an age by which a man should have found his person, built his home, and learned the shape of a shared life. Every passing year felt like evidence against me. Then something inside me whispered, "A clock can stop without time ending." I closed my hand around the watch. I cannot explain why those words came to me. Perhaps grief rearranges ordinary thoughts into revelation. Perhaps the soul knows how to speak when the mind is finally tired of arguing. But it did not feel random. A few weeks later, I missed another flight. This time, I did not curse. I stood at the gate while the last passengers disappeared down the corridor. The airport smelled of coffee, metal, and floor polish. Blue morning light pressed against the windows. A storm had delayed my connecting plane. By the time I reached the city, the meeting I had traveled for was over. Instead of returning immediately, I walked into a small bookstore near the hotel. An elderly woman behind the counter was wrapping a book in brown paper. We spoke for less than 10 minutes, yet before I left, she said, "Some people arrive late because the place was not ready for them earlier." I smiled. Years before, I would have dismissed her words as kindness. That day, they landed differently. I stopped calling myself late. I began to understand that timing was not only about my readiness. Maybe you were still healing. Maybe you were learning the difference between being chosen and being cherished. Maybe life was teaching you to stop apologizing for your depth before placing you in front of a man capable of honoring it. And maybe I had needed every lost year to become that man. That was the shift. I realized I had not been waiting outside a locked future. I had been moving toward an appointment neither of us could force. If we had met earlier, I might have admired you and still failed you. You might have loved me and mistaken my distance for mystery. We could have called it passion while repeating every wound we had inherited. Perfectly wrong timing might have destroyed what perfect timing could one day protect. Perhaps your life has also made you question the calendar. Perhaps you look at the years behind you and wonder whether love forgot your address. Listen to me. There are doors that open only when two people can enter without asking the other to carry what they refuse to heal. I no longer believe delay means denial. I believe some things take longer because they are being built to last beyond the version of us that first asked for them. That night, I repaired my father's watch. When the hands began moving again, the sound was almost too small to hear. Tick, tick, tick. I held it close and felt a strange peace. Time was not chasing me anymore. It was carrying me. And somewhere ahead, it was carrying you too. By then, I had learned not to demand explanations from every sign. Some things lost their meaning when I held them too tightly. So I began letting moments pass through me without forcing them into certainty. A familiar scent in an unfamiliar room, a name appearing twice in one day, a sudden peace arriving whenever I imagined telling someone the whole truth. I noticed. I did not chase. That was new for me. For most of my life, I had either ignored the mysterious or tried to control it. I wanted proof before trust and guarantees before surrender. But destiny, if that is what this was, did not behave like a contract. It behaved like recognition. There was an evening in early autumn when I attended a gathering I had almost declined. The house stood on a hill above the city, its windows glowing amber against the dark. Music drifted through open doors. The air smelled of cedar smoke and rain resting in the trees. I had been there less than an hour when the room suddenly became quiet inside me. People were still speaking. Glasses still touched. Someone laughed near the fireplace. Yet beneath all of it, I felt that same stillness from the highway, that same warmth from the hospital, that same impossible sense of home from the dream. Something in me whispered, "Pay attention." And then I saw you, perhaps not for the first time with my eyes, but for the first time with the part of me that had been waiting. There was nothing theatrical about it, no music rising, no world stopping for everyone else. You were simply standing near a window, listening more than speaking, with light touching one side of your face. You looked both present and far away, as though some part of you had survived a long journey no one in that room knew about. I recognized that distance. I had carried it. For a moment, I was afraid to move toward you, not because I doubted the feeling, but because I trusted it enough to be frightened by what it might require. The old man in me wanted to perform, to appear impressive, to hide vulnerability beneath charm. But another voice, quieter and stronger, said, "Do not become false now." So when we spoke, I did not try to win you. I listened. Your words were simple, but something beneath them felt familiar. You mentioned a door that had closed in your life, and I thought of every door that had closed in mine. You spoke about feeling late, and I felt my father's repaired watch against my wrist. You said you had once dreamed of a house filled with morning light. I forgot to breathe. I did not tell you then that I had walked through the same house in my sleep. Some truths are too sacred to place immediately into sound. I only looked at you, and for the first time in many years, and I did not feel watched by time. I felt met by it. I have no proof that two people can be prepared for each other through separate storms. I cannot place our timing beneath a microscope or draw a map showing how every loss led to that room, but it did not feel random. That was the night suspicion became recognition, not certainty. Recognition. I began to see that you were not entering my life as a solution to loneliness. You were arriving as a witness to the man loneliness had shaped. And I sensed that I was not meant to rescue you either. I was meant to stand beside the woman your own journey had revealed. Maybe you felt it too. Maybe something in you became still before your mind understood why. Maybe you looked at me and recognized not a stranger, but a familiar kind of ache. That is what I remember most. Not attraction, though it was there, not hope, though it terrified me. It was the feeling that we had both arrived carrying pieces of the same unfinished sentence. And somewhere beyond reason, I knew life had not brought us together merely to admire the pattern. It was asking us whether we had the courage to enter it. After I recognized you, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. Recognition is not the same as courage. It is one thing to believe destiny has brought someone near. It is another to risk becoming fully visible before them. For several days after that evening, I carried our conversation like a flame protected between my hands. I replayed your voice, the way you paused before answering certain questions, the quiet sadness that passed through your eyes when you spoke of beginning again. I wanted to reach for you, and I wanted to disappear. Both feelings were true. The old fear returned with remarkable precision. It told me that anything meaningful could be lost. That hope was merely grief arriving early, that if I kept enough distance, I could preserve the beauty of what I felt without ever allowing reality to wound it. Then, late one night, my phone rang. It was you. Outside, wind moved through the trees. The house was dark except for the lamp beside my chair. I watched your names glowing on the screen, and for one terrible second, I considered letting it stop. Something in me whispered, "This is the moment you usually run," I answered. Your voice was softer than I remembered. You said you had almost decided not to call. There was silence between us, but it was not empty. It felt like a doorway neither of us wanted to cross carelessly. Then you asked, "Do you ever feel like meeting someone can make your whole past look different?" I closed my eyes. Every missed flight, every hospital night, every relationship that failed under the weight of my fear seemed to gather around that question. "Yes," I said, "I do now. I do not have proof that one conversation can rearrange a life. But it did not feel random. We spoke until the darkness began thinning into morning. I told you things I had hidden from people who had known me for years. I told you about the highway, the hospital, the dreams. I admitted how often I had sabotaged closeness and called it discernment. You did not rescue me from the shame. You stayed beside me while I named it. That was more powerful. Perhaps you know how rare it is to be heard without being repaired. To tell the truth and feel the room remain intact. When we ended the call, birds had begun singing beyond the window. Pale light touched the walls. I felt afraid. But beneath the fear was that familiar, strange peace. I stopped calling vulnerability danger. I realized it was the path. For years, I had prayed for a love that felt destined, while imagining destiny would remove uncertainty. Instead, it brought me to a woman precious enough to make courage necessary. You were not a guarantee against pain. You were an invitation to stop living, as though pain had the final authority. That changed the way I understood us. I no longer wanted to say that every loss happened only so I could find you. that would make suffering too simple, and some wounds deserve more honesty than that. But I do believe nothing was wasted. The grief taught me tenderness. The delays taught me patience. The betrayals taught me that trust must be offered consciously, not blindly. And the loneliness taught me that love should be chosen from fullness, not panic. Maybe your past was shaping the same readiness in you. Maybe the years you thought were empty were teaching you not to abandon your own voice when someone finally listened. Maybe we were both being pulled back from smaller lives. That morning I made a decision. I would not ask destiny to do what courage required of me. I would move towards you honestly, not with promises designed to impress you, not with urgency disguised as certainty. I would offer presence, patience, and the truth of who I had become, because I had come to understand something. Destiny may arrange the meeting, but love still asks to be chosen, and I was ready to choose you, not as an answer to every ache, but as the woman beside whom I wanted to face whatever remained unanswered. There was a morning when I finally understood that destiny had never been asking me to surrender my will. It had been teaching me how to use it. The light came slowly through the curtains, pale and warm across the floor. You were asleep beside me, one hand resting near your face, your breathing quiet enough that I could hear the clock in the next room. For years, clocks had frightened me. They reminded me of endings, missed chances, the life I thought was slipping past before I had found where I belonged. That morning, time felt different. It was not taking anything from me. It had brought me here. I lay still and thought about the man from the highway, the man from the highway, the man in the hospital, the man standing alone in rooms full of applause. I remembered every door I had begged to reopen, every silence I mistook for rejection, every season when I believed I had arrived too late for love. Then I looked at you, and the years did not feel wasted. They felt gathered, not justified, not erased, gathered. Every version of me had carried something to this room. The frightened boy, the ambitious man, the broken patient, the lonely stranger who whispered prayers toward a woman he could not yet see. They had all been walking towards you. But I know now, Yao, that you were walking too. You were not waiting motionless for me to arrive. You were surviving your own storms, learning your own sacred boundaries, being pulled back from people and places that would have asked you to disappear. Perhaps there were nights when you thought your tenderness had become a burden. Perhaps you wondered whether being strong for so long had made you impossible to hold. It had not. You were never too late. You were becoming someone who could enter love without abandoning herself. And I was becoming someone who would never ask you to. That was the final shift in me. I stopped seeing destiny as a promise that nothing painful would happen again. I began seeing it as the strange grace that brought two imperfect people to the same place with enough awareness to remain, because shared peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is knowing whose hand you will reach for when the room becomes dark. It is making coffee while rain touches the windows. It is telling the truth before silence hardens. It is sitting beside each other without needing to perform happiness. It is building a home where neither person must earn the right to rest. That is the life I see with you. Not a perfect life, a faithful one. There will be days when old fears return. I may still grow quiet when I should speak. You may still wonder whether love can remain after seeing every wound. When that happens, I want us to remember the road behind us, the missed flights, the narrow escapes, the perfectly wrong timing, the doors that closed before we understood their mercy. I want us to remember that we did not arrive here untouched. We arrived awake. I do not have proof that our names were written beside each other before we met. I only know that too many moments pointed towards you for me to call them accidents. So I accept what brought me here, and I choose you, not because destiny removes choice, but because it has made the choice clear. Now I am asking you to choose something too. Choose hope again. Choose the possibility that your delays were not evidence of abandonment. Choose to believe that the love meant for you will not require you to become smaller. Choose to leave one door open inside your heart. And if your heart felt seen in this confession, stay close to this space. Subscribe, share it, or leave your story, not for numbers, but so someone still waiting in the dark might discover they have not been forgotten. Because some of us are not lost. We are simply being guided toward an appointment. And sometimes after a lifetime of almosts, we arrive exactly on time.